Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the incredibly captivating, utterly thrilling world of ancient Babylonian accounting. Yes, you heard that right. Forget dragons, forget epic battles we're talking about, clay tablets, reed styluses, and the meticulous tracking of barley. Imagine, if you will, the gentle, rhythmic scratching of a scribe's reed on soft, wet clay. The flickering lamplight casting long shadows across countless rows of numerical notations. You can almost smell the damp earth of the unbaked tablet. Feel the cool air of a windowless storeroom filled with the scent of dried reeds and an almost imperceptible hint of economic anxiety. This isn't just about numbers. It's about the very foundations of civilization built brick by painstaking brick, and more importantly recorded, painstakingly tablet by tablet. You're about to embark on a journey through the surprisingly intricate financial systems of a society that existed thousands of years before spreadsheets, before calculators, before even the concept of zero as we know it. So yeah, you probably won't survive this without at least a mild case of historical narcolepsy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always wild to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the banks of the Euphrates, the warm, thick air of Mesopotamia wrapping around you like a heavy blanket. The year, let's say, is roughly 3200 BCE. The very concept of writing, of meticulously capturing thoughts and transactions, is still a fresh, mind-bending innovation. And where does it all begin? Not with heroic epics or love poems, oh no. It begins with counting. Specifically counting goods. You see, as societies grew beyond simple hunter-gatherer bands, as agriculture started producing surpluses, and as people began to specialize, the need to keep track of who owes what to whom became absolutely paramount. You can't just eyeball a harvest and remember every single grain that went into the communal storehouse. That's a recipe for chaos and probably a few very angry farmers. Enter the first iteration of cuneiform. It's not elegant at first. Imagine taking a piece of soft clay, fresh from the riverbed, and pressing a sharpened reed into it. You're making wedges. Lots and lots of wedges. That's what cuneiform actually means, wedge-shaped. These aren't beautiful flowing scripts like you might imagine from later civilizations. These are blunt, almost brutal impressions. Each mark isn't a letter in an alphabet. It's often a pictogram representing an object or a numerical value. Think of it like this. You've got a picture of a head with a bowl next to it, which might mean ration. Then you add some wedge marks that indicate 2 or 10. Suddenly you have a record, 2 rations for so-and-so. Revolutionary. Right, historians still argue whether the primary driver for writing was religious inscription or economic necessity, but the overwhelming evidence points to the latter. It was all about the numbers, the inventory, the tracking of barley and sheep and oil. These were the earliest spreadsheets etched not onto glowing screens, but into squishy clay. You can almost hear the ancient accountants sighing as they tally another shipment of dates. It was far from glamorous, but it was the bedrock upon which mighty empires would eventually rise. This wasn't about telling grand stories yet. It was about ensuring that the granary matched the scroll, or rather the tablet. The very act of forming these marks, pressing that reed repeatedly over and over, was a physical manifestation of order emerging from the swirling dust of daily life. It was repetitive, yes, but think of the sheer intellectual leap required to formalize these fleeting transactions into permanent, tangible records. It was less about poetic prose and more about, did we get that shipment of wool from the northern pastures, and how many bundles were there exactly? The future of civilization, it turned out, depended on someone being good at counting. From those humble wedge-shaped beginnings, you now fast forward a few centuries, and suddenly the landscape of record-keeping has blossomed, albeit in a very dry, dusty, and repetitive way. No longer are we just talking about simple pictograms. We're deep into the era of specialized labor, and perhaps no profession was more crucial, yet more mind-numbingly monotonous than that of the scribe. Imagine their daily grind. You're not just doodling on clay anymore. You're operating within a highly structured system, a precursor to what we might call a corporate environment today. Your typical Babylonian scribe, probably a young man from a relatively well-off family, because schooling wasn't cheap or accessible to everyone, would spend years, and we mean years, learning this craft. Think about it: no pencils, no paper, no erasers. Just a lump of wet clay, a stylus, and an incredible amount of patience. You'd sit cross-legged, probably on a reed mat, in a room that smelled faintly of damp earth and stale oil, painstakingly practicing your cuneiform signs. It wasn't just about writing, it was about numbers. Oh, the numbers. The Babylonians had a sexagesimal system, a base 60 system. We, of course, use a base 10 system, which seems perfectly logical to us. But imagine trying to do long division when your number system is based on 60. It's like trying to count your fingers and toes, but then suddenly having to account for the seconds in a minute, or the minutes in an hour, all at once. No wonder they had specialized schools just for this. A good scribe had to be a human calculator, a living abacus. They'd be responsible for tracking everything from the yield of a field to the inventory of a temple storehouse. They'd calculate interest on loans, figure out how much silver was equivalent to how many bushels of grain, and record every single transaction, no matter how small. It was rote memorization, endless practice, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. One misplaced wedge, one wrong number, and suddenly you've got an angry merchant or a temple administrator breathing down your neck. The pressure was real. They even had specific tablets for practicing signs, like ancient school notebooks filled with repeated characters. You can almost feel the wrist cramps. It wasn't just about literacy, it was about numeracy. These scribes were the financial backbone of their society. They weren't just writing down numbers. They were creating the financial records that allowed complex economic systems to flourish. Without them, it would have been utter chaos. How would you know if the palace received all the tribute it was owed? How would a merchant track his profits from a long trading journey? The answer, of course, was the scribe sitting there, patiently pressing mark after mark into the pliable clay. Historians still argue whether the scribe's role was purely administrative, or if they wielded significant political influence due to their unique skill set. Think about it: if you're the only one who can read and write the incredibly complex records that underpin an entire city's economy, you've got a certain leverage, don't you? It's a bit like being the only IT guy in a massive corporation. Everyone needs you. Everyone defers to your expertise, even if they don't quite understand what you do. The scribes were the gatekeepers of information, the custodians of the ledger, and in a society built on trust and meticulously recorded transactions that made them indispensable. You might even say they were the original spreadsheet wizards, just without the fancy software. Their tools were simple, but their impact was profound, laying the groundwork for every accountant, bookkeeper, and financial analyst who would come after them. They literally wrote the book on how to run an economy. With the scribes diligently scratching away, you now find yourself amidst the colossal structures that truly defined early Babylonian economic life, the temples. Forget what you might traditionally think of as a temple, a place solely for quiet worship and spiritual contemplation. In ancient Mesopotamia, particularly in cities like Ur or Babylon itself, the temple complex was less like a modern church and more like a combination of a sprawling agricultural cooperative, a major bank, a bustling marketplace, and a central administrative hub, all rolled into one. These were the true corporate headquarters of their time. Imagine walking through its vast courtyards. You wouldn't just see priests making offerings. You'd see farmers bringing in their harvest as tithes, merchants negotiating deals, and administrators, often scribes themselves, overseeing a dizzying array of activities. The ziggurat, that massive terraced pyramid, might have been the spiritual heart, but the sprawling complex at its base was the economic engine. This was where wealth flowed in and out, where resources were managed on a truly grand scale. The temple owned vast tracts of land. We're talking about thousands of acres cultivated by tenant farmers, who paid a portion of their yield directly to the temple granaries. So if you were a temple administrator, you weren't just concerned with the gods' whims. You were deeply invested in crop yields, irrigation schedules, and the productivity of countless laborers. Every single sack of barley, every flock of sheep, every jar of olive oil that entered or left the temple's control had to be meticulously recorded. This wasn't just about religious piety. It was about massive-scale resource management. Think of it as a pre-industrial supply chain managed with clay tablets. These temple complexes often housed massive storehouses, granaries, and even workshops where goods were produced. We're talking textiles, pottery tools, all under the temple's purview. The temple would employ specialized artisans, pay them in rations, which of course the scribes had to meticulously track, and then either use the goods internally or trade them. This made the temple a central player in both production and distribution, essentially functioning as a proto-state economy. It was the largest employer, the largest landowner, and arguably the largest financial institution. What's truly fascinating is how this system fostered an environment where accounting wasn't just useful, it was absolutely essential for survival. How else could you manage the inflow and outflow of resources for potentially tens of thousands of people associated with the temple? You couldn't just have a mental tally. The sheer volume of transactions demanded a rigorous system of checks and balances. Records were kept of everything: offerings received, rations distributed, laborers employed, land leased, goods traded. It was an administrative behemoth built on a foundation of meticulously etched clay. Historians still argue whether the power of the early temples was primarily spiritual, with economic might as a natural consequence, or if their economic dominance allowed them to exert spiritual control. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? But regardless of the ultimate causality, the outcome was clear. The temple was the economic heartbeat of ancient Mesopotamian cities, driving the demand for precise, reliable accounting. They weren't just asking for divine blessings. They were demanding a detailed ledger of every single shekel's worth of barley. As you mentally navigate the bustling temple economy, you're constantly bumping up against a fundamental truth of ancient commerce, the pervasive, sometimes bewildering system of barter. Forget credit cards, forget cash, forget even simple coins. In early Babylon, almost all transactions involved the direct exchange of goods and services. This sounds quaint, even idyllic, but in practice it was a logistical nightmare that screamingly necessitated good accounting. Imagine for a moment you're a farmer, and you've got a surplus of barley. You need a new plowshare, but the blacksmith doesn't need barley. He needs wool for his new tunic, so you can't just pay him. You have to find someone who has wool and needs barley. And then once you've got the wool, you still need to convince the blacksmith that your particular bundle of sheep fibers is worth his finely crafted metal. It's like a perpetually unfolding three-dimensional chess game where everyone's trying to offload their stuff for someone else's stuff. No wonder everyone was a bit stressed. This double coincidence of wants, where two people each have something the other wants, was the holy grail of ancient transactions, and it rarely happened smoothly. So what did they do? They introduced intermediaries. Perhaps the temple itself would act as a middleman, taking your barley, giving you a receipt, and then using that barley to pay the wool producer, who then pays the blacksmith. Or maybe there was a local market where you could haggle, but even then, how do you agree on a fair exchange rate between, say, a goat and a clay pot? Is it one goat for 5 pots or 7? What if the goat is particularly stubborn? This is precisely where accounting became not just helpful, but absolutely critical, because without a common medium of exchange, you needed a way to value disparate goods and services against each other. How many bushels of wheat equals 1 sheep? How many days of labor equals 1 jar of oil? The scribes, remember them from section 2, became the arbiters of these informal exchange rates, noting them down with painstaking precision. They weren't just recording transactions. They were helping to define value in a pre-monetary world. Think of a modern-day spreadsheet trying to track trades in a market where every single item has a constantly fluctuating value relative to every other item. That's what Babylonian scribes were managing on clay tablets. They would record, for instance, 20 bundles of dates exchanged for 3 clay vessels. Then, perhaps later, 3 clay vessels exchanged for 1 silver ring. They were creating a de facto chain of value, even if no actual silver as a coin changed hands in the initial transaction. This required incredible mental agility and a very standardized way of thinking about quantities and equivalences. Historians still argue whether some form of proto-money, perhaps specific quantities of barley or silver, by weight emerged before widespread barter, or if barter itself led to the need for such standardized measures. It's a fascinating debate. But what's clear is that the very messiness of barter forced the Babylonians to develop sophisticated ways of tracking value and debt. It was about creating order out of what could easily have been economic chaos. Every exchange, no matter how small, was a puzzle, and the scribes were the ones meticulously piecing together the solution, one wedge mark at a time. It's a testament to human ingenuity faced with the problem of, how do I get that farmer to give me his goat for my extra pottery? They didn't just shrug. They invented accounting. Given the delightful chaos of barter you just endured, you might be wondering how the Babylonians managed to bring any semblance of order to their transactions. How did they standardize value when one person's goat was another's dusty inconvenience? The answer lies not in a shiny coin, but in a precisely measured quantity, the shekel. Now, when you hear shekel, your brain probably conjures images of ancient coins, perhaps clinking in a merchant's pouch. But in ancient Babylon, especially in the period we're focusing on, the shekel was not a coin. It was a unit of weight, specifically for silver. Think of it less like a dollar bill and more like a specific measured spoonful of sugar. Or perhaps a tiny, perfectly proportioned silver bar. The concept was crucial. Rather than exchanging arbitrary quantities of goods, items could be valued in terms of a universally recognized, measurable commodity. Silver. So if a farmer wanted that plowshare from the blacksmith, and the blacksmith wasn't interested in barley, they would agree on a value in shekels of silver. That plowshare is worth 5 shekels of silver, the blacksmith might say. Now the farmer didn't necessarily have 5 shekels of silver in his pocket. Instead, he might offer goods that were equivalent to 5 shekels of silver, perhaps a certain weight of barley, or a number of sheep, or even a specific quantity of oil. The silver shekel acted as the abstract unit of account, the common denominator that allowed everyone to understand the value of different goods relative to one another. It was the Excel spreadsheet equivalent column, even if no physical silver ever moved. This standardization was revolutionary. It moved transactions beyond the messy, "I want what you have," direct exchange into a more sophisticated system where value was consistently measured. Suddenly a merchant could price his goods in shekels, knowing that whether he received barley dates or even labor in return, it could all be converted back to a silver equivalent. This made trade much more efficient and predictable. It was the first step towards a universal currency, even if that currency was just a concept of value rather than a circulating object. Imagine the scribes at work here. They wouldn't just record 20 jars of oil for 3 sheep. Instead, they might record 20 jars of oil, valued at 0.5 shekels per jar, for 3 sheep valued at 3.33 shekels per sheep approximately. This allowed for incredibly precise accounting and comparisons. It also laid the groundwork for complex financial transactions like loans and interest, which we'll delve into soon. If you're lending grain, you need to know its value in a standard unit to calculate the interest accurately. Historians still argue whether the widespread adoption of silver as a standardized unit of weight for trade was a natural evolution of market forces or a deliberate policy imposed by powerful temple or palace authorities. Perhaps it was a bit of both practical necessity leading to official endorsement. What is undeniable, however, is the profound impact of this standardization. It was a massive leap forward from the pure chaos of direct barter, giving ancient Mesopotamian accountants a stable reference point for all their meticulous calculations. It's like discovering the metric system after centuries of arguing over whether a cubit was the length of your arm or your neighbor's. Suddenly, everyone's speaking the same economic language, even if that language is just weight of silver. With the shekel now firmly established as the abstract unit of value, you might next wonder what real-world commodities truly powered the Babylonian economy and consequently dominated the scribes' clay ledgers. While silver held the conceptual weight, 2 tangible goods were the beating heart of daily life, and the most frequently traded and accounted for items, grain and oil. Imagine the vast fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. This was Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and its very lifeblood was agriculture. Foremost among the crops was barley, not just any grain, but the grain. It was the primary food source used for bread porridge and crucially for brewing beer, a staple drink for everyone from kings to common laborers. Consequently, barley often served as a de facto currency for everyday transactions, especially for paying wages or settling small debts. If you were paid for your labor, chances are a portion of it, if not all, came in sacks of barley. This meant the meticulous accounting of barley was paramount. Every harvest, every shipment to the granary, every distribution as wages or rations, all of it was recorded with excruciating detail. Imagine the temple scribes tracking literally tons of barley, noting its quality, its origin, and its destination. It was the ultimate inventory management system, but instead of scanning barcodes, they were pressing wedges into wet clay, meticulously counting sacks and measuring volumes. A good harvest meant prosperity. A bad one, meticulously recorded, meant potential famine and social unrest. Then there was oil. While we might think of olive oil in ancient Mesopotamia, it was more likely sesame oil. This wasn't just for cooking. It was a multi-purpose essential. It was used as a foodstuff, a cosmetic, a lubricant, a fuel for lamps, and even for medicinal purposes. Think of it as their ancient equivalent of petroleum jelly, cooking oil and lamp oil all rolled into one. And just like barley oil was a highly valuable commodity, often used in trade and as a form of payment, the scribes therefore spent an enormous amount of time tracking quantities of oil. How many jars were produced? How much was stored in the temple vaults? How much was allocated for royal use, or distributed to soldiers, or traded with foreign merchants? These records give us an incredible glimpse into the consumption patterns and economic priorities of the time. You can almost picture the long rows of clay tablets, each one detailing another shipment of sesame oil, another delivery of barley. It sounds incredibly dull, and frankly it probably was, but it was absolutely vital. One quirky tidbit: the Babylonians even had specific measurements for things like seed grain, carefully distinguished from bread grain or beer grain. This level of granularity in their accounting shows just how seriously they took their staple commodities. It wasn't just about the quantity, it was about the purpose and quality of the grain, all meticulously noted. Historians still argue whether the dominance of grain and oil as primary commodities inhibited the development of a more robust, coin-based monetary system earlier in Babylonian history. Was it simply too efficient to use what was directly consumed, or did the very abundance of these goods prevent the need for a more abstract form of wealth? Regardless, the sheer volume of records dedicated to these two humble commodities underscores their central role. They were the engines of the Babylonian economy, and their consistent, accurate tracking was a monumental task, giving future historians a window into the granular details of ancient Mesopotamian life. Having delved into the tangible world of grain and oil and the abstract value of the shekel, you're now poised to uncover one of the more surprising elements of Babylonian finance: the sophisticated and sometimes predatory concept of interest. Yes, even thousands of years ago, people were lending money, or more accurately commodities, and expecting a return. The ancient Mesopotamians were in many ways the original loan sharks, though perhaps with a bit more legal oversight. Imagine a farmer whose harvest has failed due to an unexpected flood, or a merchant needing capital to fund a risky but potentially lucrative trade expedition. Where do they turn? To the temples, certainly, or to wealthy individuals who had surplus commodities. These lenders weren't doing it out of charity. They expected something back, and that something was interest. This wasn't some back-alley deal. It was a formalized, recorded practice, often etched onto those very same clay tablets. The rates of interest were surprisingly standardized. For loans of grain, a common rate was 20% of the principal. So if you borrowed 100 gyur, a unit of volume for grain, you'd be expected to pay back 120 gyur. For loans of silver or goods valued in silver shekels, the rate was often higher, around 33.3% or one-third. That's a hefty sum. No wonder debt accumulation was such a significant issue in Babylonian society, often leading to dire consequences. These interest rates weren't just plucked out of thin air. They were often regulated by royal decrees, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, which we'll explore later. The laws attempted to put limits on usury to prevent excessive exploitation of debtors. However, the very existence of these laws tells you that the practice of lending at interest was widespread and a potential source of social tension. A quirky tidbit that might make your modern banker sigh in envy: some Babylonian loans were self-repaying. Imagine a loan for seeds. The agreement might stipulate that a percentage of the harvest itself would be returned as interest rather than a fixed sum. This cleverly linked the repayment to the success of the agricultural venture, distributing some of the risk between borrower and lender. It's like a very early form of profit sharing, or perhaps just a very efficient way to ensure the lender got their cut directly from the source. The scribes, of course, were central to all of this. They weren't just recording loans. They were calculating the interest, drafting the repayment schedules, and documenting every payment received. They had to be meticulous mathematicians to ensure that the principal plus interest was accurately collected. These tablets detailing loans and repayments are invaluable historical sources, showing us the flow of capital and credit within their economy. You can see patterns of seasonal borrowing, the impact of good and bad harvests, and the financial pressures on different segments of society. Historians still argue whether the high interest rates in Babylon were a reflection of genuine economic risk or primarily a tool for wealth concentration by powerful institutions and individuals. Was it truly necessary to charge 20 or 33% interest to cover the risks of non-repayment and the opportunity cost of the lent commodities, or was it simply a mechanism for the rich to get richer? It's a debate that echoes even today, doesn't it? But for ancient Babylon, interest was an undeniable, deeply integrated part of their sophisticated financial landscape, one that kept scribes busy and many a farmer awake at night. As you drift deeper into the intricacies of Babylonian accounting, you move from the abstract world of shekels and interest to something much more tangible, something that truly anchored individuals and families to the earth: property deeds. In a society built on agriculture, land was power, security, and identity. And just like today, who owned what and where was a matter of meticulous record. Imagine standing on a dusty plain, looking out at a patchwork of cultivated fields. Every single one of those plots, every orchard, every patch of reeds by the canal had an owner. And that ownership, whether by an individual, a family, a temple, or the king, was not simply a matter of word of mouth. It was enshrined on a clay tablet, legally binding and meticulously detailed. These weren't just informal agreements. They were the ancient world's equivalent of land titles, blueprints, and zoning maps, all rolled into one sturdy piece of baked earth. A typical Babylonian property deed tablet would contain an astonishing amount of detail. It wouldn't just state, "Farmer Nabu owns this field." Oh no, it would specify the precise dimensions of the plot, often in terms of length and width, using standard units like cubits or rods. It would describe the boundaries, sometimes naming adjacent property owners or landmarks like canals, roads, or even specific trees. Imagine the painstaking work of surveying these irregular plots, trying to get the measurements just right, then translating that into the precise wedge marks on a tablet. It was land management at its most fundamental. These deeds weren't just for sales. They covered leases, inheritances, and even gifts. If a father bequeathed a portion of his land to his son, that transaction was recorded. If a temple leased out a field to a sharecropper, the terms of that lease, how much grain was owed for how long, were all written down. This created a remarkably clear chain of title, essential for a stable society and for resolving disputes. Remember that problematic barter system? Well, imagine trying to barter something as complex as a piece of land without ironclad records. One quirky tidbit about these deeds: some of the more elaborate tablets, especially royal land grants, were called kuduru. These weren't just administrative documents. They were often beautifully carved stone steles depicting the gods who sanctioned the grant, and often containing curses against anyone who dared to deface or alter the inscription. It was an early form of property law, combined with divine protection, proving that they really wanted these records to stick around. You certainly wouldn't want to accidentally knock over a kuduru during your morning stroll. The importance of these records for historians cannot be overstated. They give us an unparalleled insight into land ownership patterns, agricultural practices, inheritance laws, and the socio-economic structure of ancient Babylon. They show us how land was fragmented or consolidated over generations, how families gained and lost wealth, and how the economy was literally rooted in the earth. Without these diligently kept records, much of our understanding of Babylonian society would be pure conjecture. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of private land ownership in certain periods was a sign of greater individual autonomy or merely a more efficient system for the state or temples to extract resources. Was owning land a true path to independence for a farmer, or just a different mechanism for paying taxes and tributes? Regardless, the fact that such detailed records were kept underscores the immense value placed on land and the absolute necessity of accurate accounting to manage it. These clay deeds were the silent guarantors of wealth, the enduring evidence of who held the literal ground beneath their feet. From the solid ground of property deeds, you now shift your focus to the intricate web of human agreements that bound Babylonian society together. Contracts. In a world without easily enforceable written laws, in every town square, a contract etched onto a clay tablet served as the ultimate proof of a deal, a promise, or an obligation. These weren't just informal handshakes. They were legally binding documents, meticulously crafted by scribes, witnessed and stored for posterity. Imagine being in ancient Babylon and needing to formalize an agreement. Perhaps you're a merchant entering into a partnership to share the profits and risks of a long-distance trading venture. Or maybe you're arranging a marriage, and the dowry and bride price need to be clearly stipulated. Whatever the transaction, large or small, if it involves significant value or a long-term commitment, a clay tablet was involved. It was the ancient notary public legal counsel and document storage system all rolled into one. A typical contract tablet would begin with an invocation to a deity lending divine authority to the agreement, followed by the names of the parties involved. Then came the detailed terms, what was being exchanged for, how much, the dates of delivery or payment, and any specific conditions. For a loan, it would state the principal, the interest rate, remember those, and the repayment schedule. For a sale, it would list the item, the price in shekels, and confirm the transfer of ownership. Every possible contingency seemed to be covered, reflecting a society that understood the importance of clarity and the potential for disputes. But the real power of these contracts came from the witnesses. Numerous individuals, often prominent members of the community, would physically impress their cylinder seals onto the wet clay of the tablet. These seals, unique to each individual, were the ancient equivalent of a signature and fingerprint combined. They signified that the witness had been present during the agreement and attested to its validity. Then the tablet would often be enclosed in a clay envelope, also sealed to protect it from tampering. If a dispute arose, the envelope would be broken open and the inner tablet consulted. It was a remarkably secure system for its time. A quirky tidbit: some contracts had very specific clauses related to breaking the agreement. For instance, a contract for the sale of a slave might include a clause stating that if the slave proved to be rebellious, the seller had to provide a replacement. Or, in a particularly grim example, some contracts involving debt might stipulate that failure to repay could result in the debtor or a family member becoming debt slaves, a harsh reality we'll touch on later. These contract tablets provide an invaluable window into the daily lives, economic activities, and legal frameworks of ancient Babylon. They show us how society was structured, what kinds of businesses flourished, and how disputes were ideally resolved. They reveal the intricate social and economic relationships between individuals, families, temples, and the state. Without these millions of tiny, unassuming clay records, our understanding of Babylonian social and economic history would be vastly poor. Historians still argue whether the extensive use of written contracts in Babylon fostered a culture of trust and predictability in commerce, or if it primarily served to protect the interests of the powerful and literate against the less fortunate. Was it a tool for fairness or a mechanism for control? Regardless, the sheer volume and meticulous detail of these ancient contracts demonstrate an undeniable commitment to formalizing agreements, laying the groundwork for complex legal systems that would evolve over millennia, right up to the legal documents you might encounter today. From the intricate world of private agreements, you now turn your gaze towards the largest financial entity of ancient Babylon, the king and the state. And what does every state, ancient or modern, absolutely depend upon for its very existence? Taxes. Even in Mesopotamia, long before the invention of the complicated forms and endless audits, we know today the royal coffers were filled through a surprisingly organized system of extraction. Imagine the king seated on his throne, perhaps reviewing a massive stack of clay tablets brought by his chief scribes. These aren't just personal accounts. These are the detailed records of the kingdom's income. Because even in a world of limited cash flow, the state needed resources to maintain its army, build its monumental ziggurats and palaces, fund irrigation projects, and support the vast bureaucracy, including all those diligent scribes. The Babylonian tax system wasn't like our modern income tax. Instead, it was primarily based on what we might call tribute or levies on various resources and activities. The most significant form was often a percentage of the agricultural yield. Farmers cultivating royal lands or even temple lands would owe a portion of their harvest directly to the state. This meant scribes were constantly busy, not just recording personal harvests, but calculating the royal share, ensuring every grain of barley or every jar of oil found its way to the central storehouses. It was a massive logistical and accounting challenge. Beyond agricultural produce, other forms of taxation existed. There were levies on goods moved along trade routes, a kind of ancient customs duty. Craftsmen might have owed a portion of their manufactured goods, or a certain number of days of labor. Even military service could be seen as a form of tax, a contribution to the state's security. The goal was always to extract enough resources to power the machinery of the empire, and every single extraction had to be recorded. You can almost hear the royal scribes muttering about fiscal years as they tally the incoming goods. One fascinating aspect of this system was the concept of the ilku, or redu service, a form of feudal tenure where individuals were granted land in exchange for military service or other state obligations. The meticulous records of who owed what service and for how long were a vital part of the royal accounting. If you were granted land, you had an obligation, and the scribes made sure that obligation was fulfilled. It was an ingenious system for maintaining an army and labor force without a direct monetary economy. A quirky tidbit sometimes: if a city was conquered, part of its tax, or tribute to the victorious king, would be a certain number of skilled craftsmen, or even scribes themselves, effectively a transfer of human capital. Imagine being taxed away from your home city to go work for a new, often less friendly king. Definitely not ideal. These tax records, when unearthed by archaeologists, provide an invaluable understanding of the economic power of the Babylonian state, the distribution of wealth, and the priorities of the ruling elite. They show us how much the king was able to extract from his subjects, and how those resources were then redistributed or invested in state projects. Without the scribes diligently keeping these ledgers, the king would have been flying blind, never knowing if his coffers were full or if a rebellion was brewing due to excessive taxation. Historians still argue whether the Babylonian tax system was primarily extractive, designed solely to enrich the ruling class, or if it also served as a mechanism for public works and economic stability, providing essential services in return for levies. Was it a burden or a necessary investment in public infrastructure? Either way, the meticulous accounting of every grain, every jar, and every person's obligation underscores the sophistication of ancient statecraft and the critical role of careful record-keeping in maintaining power and order. From the dry ledgers of state taxes, you now lift your gaze to behold the colossal achievements that those resources funded: the magnificent ziggurats. These towering stepped structures weren't just places of worship. They were immense public works, projects, testaments to royal power and engineering prowess. And behind every colossal brick, laid every ramp constructed, lay an accounting challenge of truly epic proportions. Imagine trying to build something the size of a small mountain thousands of years ago with nothing but hand tools, human muscle, and incredibly rudimentary hauling methods. The sheer logistics are staggering. You need tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of sun-dried bricks. You need stone for facings, timber for internal structures, and scaffolding vast quantities of bitumen, a natural asphalt-like substance used as mortar and clay for the mortar itself. Every single one of these materials had to be sourced, transported, accounted for upon arrival, and then distributed to the right work gangs. Then there's the workforce. Building a ziggurat wasn't a small weekend project. It took years, sometimes decades, involving thousands of laborers, skilled craftsmen like bricklayers and carpenters, and vast numbers of unskilled workers hauling earth and materials. Each of these workers needed to be fed, watered, and paid. And remember, paid in ancient Babylon often meant rations of barley oil or beer. So the temple or royal administration overseeing the ziggurat construction needed an army of scribes just to manage the daily distribution of provisions to thousands of mouths. Think of the inventory management alone. Okay, we received 10,000 bricks today. That's enough for another 2 courses on the second terrace. But we're running low on bitumen, and the team on the east side needs more reed mats for their ramps. Every single material inflow and outflow had to be meticulously logged. If the accounts didn't balance, if supplies ran short, or if a work gang wasn't properly fed, the entire project could grind to a halt, or worse, lead to unrest. This was accounting as a critical component of project management on a scale rarely seen before or since. A particularly quirky tidbit: the Babylonians were so good at brick production and accounting that they often stamped individual bricks with the king's name or a dedication. This wasn't just for vanity. It also served as a quality control measure and helped track production from different workshops. Imagine your modern building materials arriving with the CEO's personal stamp. A bit much, perhaps, but effective for ancient oversight. The records related to ziggurat construction are a goldmine for historians. They offer insights into ancient labor practices, supply chains, engineering methods, and the sheer organizational capacity of the Babylonian state. They show how resources were mobilized on an unprecedented scale, and how meticulous record-keeping was absolutely essential to keeping such monumental projects on track. They reveal the sheer economic muscle required to build these towering tributes to the gods and kings, and the silent, patient work of the scribes who kept the ledgers balanced. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for building these massive ziggurats was purely religious devotion, a demonstration of royal power, or perhaps even a form of early unemployment. Relief keeping a large population busy during non-farming seasons. Was it spiritual fervor or economic necessity that drove these monumental efforts? Regardless, these colossal structures are enduring symbols of Babylonian ambition, and a stark reminder that even the grandest visions require incredibly boring yet utterly vital accounting to become reality. Having surveyed the immense internal projects of Babylon, you now expand your perspective to the vast networks that connected Mesopotamia to the wider ancient world, the trade routes. From the cedar forests of Lebanon to the lapis lazuli mines of Afghanistan, goods flowed in and out of Babylon, creating a complex web of transactions that demanded an equally complex system of distant ledgers. Imagine a caravan, a long line of donkeys laden with precious cargo, slowly trudging across the sun-baked desert. They might be carrying Mesopotamian textiles and grain west towards the Mediterranean, or returning east with copper from Anatolia, tin from distant lands, and exotic spices from the Arabian Peninsula. This wasn't just about bartering a few items. It was organized large-scale international commerce, fraught with risks from bandits to shifting political landscapes. For a merchant or a temple trading house, managing these ventures required an extraordinary level of foresight and meticulous record-keeping. Before a caravan even set out, scribes would draw up detailed contracts specifying the goods being transported, their estimated value in shekels, the partners involved in the venture, and the expected profits. This was their ancient business plan etched in clay. They would also record the capital invested, whether it was silver, grain, or other commodities. As the goods traveled, keeping track of them was a continuous challenge. While there wasn't real-time tracking like we have today, records were kept at various points. For instance, if goods passed through a city controlled by another power, customs duties might be levied, and those payments would be recorded. Upon the caravan's return, the actual goods brought back would be meticulously compared against the original manifest. Discrepancies meant losses, theft, or perhaps unexpected gains, all of which had to be accounted for. One particularly clever accounting trick employed was the use of bully and tokens. Before writing was fully developed, small clay tokens representing quantities of goods would be placed inside hollow clay balls, the bully. These balls would then be sealed. If a dispute arose, the bulla could be broken and the tokens counted, proving what had been sent or received. Later, with cuneiform, the details of the transaction were often written on the outside of the bulla, creating an early form of bill of lading or invoice. It was a physical manifestation of a sealed agreement, preventing anyone from tampering with the record. A quirky tidbit: some tablets reveal records of missing goods from caravans, detailing the investigations launched to find out if they were lost, stolen, or perhaps misplaced by an unscrupulous trader. Even then, supply chain integrity was a headache. You can almost hear the ancient equivalents of "Where's my order?" being shouted across a dusty marketplace. These trade records are invaluable because they paint a picture of Babylon's interconnectedness with the ancient world. They show us the vast distances Mesopotamian traders covered, the types of goods exchanged, and the economic dependencies that stretched across continents. They reveal the risks and rewards of ancient commerce and the ingenuity required to manage it without modern communication or transport. Historians still argue whether the scale and sophistication of Babylonian trade were primarily driven by the accumulation of private wealth or by the state's need for strategic resources not available domestically. Was it free enterprise or state-sponsored resource acquisition that truly fueled these long-distance ventures? Regardless of the primary driver, the existence of these meticulous records underscores that managing a far-flung trade empire required an accounting system that was just as expansive and detailed as the routes themselves. Having explored the economic arteries of trade, you now turn to the skeletal structure that gave Babylonian society its form and, crucially, its financial discipline: Hammurabi's Code. While often celebrated as one of the earliest comprehensive legal codes, you'll find that a significant portion of its 282 laws directly addresses economic transactions, property rights, debt, and professional responsibilities, making it a foundational text for legal accounting. Imagine entering a bustling Babylonian city square. You might see a massive stone stele or stela standing tall, inscribed with the laws of King Hammurabi. This wasn't just a list of do's and don'ts. It was an attempt to bring order and predictability to a complex society, particularly in its economic dealings. And for anyone involved in commerce, from the grand merchant to the humble artisan, understanding these laws was paramount because they directly impacted their financial well-being. The code covers a bewildering array of economic situations. It specifies, for instance, the proper wages for various laborers, from field workers to ox drivers, and sets the fees for certain services like surgery. Though if the surgery went wrong, the surgeon's hand might be cut off, so definitely a different kind of liability. It dictates prices for certain goods and sets limits on interest rates, showing an early attempt at economic regulation. Remember those high interest rates we discussed earlier? Hammurabi's code tried to rein them in, suggesting that unchecked lending was a significant social issue. More importantly, for our journey into accounting, the code lays down severe penalties for financial fraud, negligence, and breach of contract. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed the owner, the builder could be put to death. If a storehouse manager embezzled grain, they faced hefty fines, sometimes multiple times the amount stolen. This created a strong incentive for meticulous record-keeping and honest accounting. If your ledgers were messy, or, worse, fraudulent, the consequences could be dire. It was a clear message: keep your books straight, or face the music. Or, in some cases, the river, as certain punishments involved being thrown into the Euphrates. A particularly quirky tidbit from the code: there are detailed laws regarding renting oxen and the responsibilities of the person renting them. If an ox died under your care, you might have to replace it. But if it was struck by a god, presumably by lightning, though not specified, you might be absolved. Proving struck by a god would certainly make for an interesting entry in the accounts. The code also codified the obligations related to loans and debt slavery, a grim reality of Babylonian life. It allowed for debt to be worked off over a period of years, but it also outlined the circumstances under which a family member could be enslaved for a parent's debt. This underscores the immense pressure on debtors and the critical role of accurate accounting in managing these life-or-death financial burdens. Historians still argue whether Hammurabi's code was primarily a set of actively enforced laws or more of a declaration of ideal justice and moral principles, a guide for judges to interpret. Was every transgression met with the exact punishment outlined on the stele, or was there more flexibility in practice? Regardless, its existence profoundly shaped the economic landscape, demanding a level of financial transparency and accountability that was groundbreaking for its time. It's a testament to the idea that complex societies require clear rules for economic engagement, and that those rules ultimately rely on meticulously kept records. The scribes, therefore, weren't just bookkeepers. They were integral to the very legal fabric of the state. From the legal pronouncements of Hammurabi's code, which threatened severe penalties for financial misdeeds, you can probably guess the natural next step in the evolution of Babylonian accounting audits. Yes, even in ancient Mesopotamia, long before the Big Four accounting firms, there was a clear understanding that books needed to be checked, numbers verified, and potential fraud rooted out. Because where there's money, or grain, or silver, there will always be someone trying to get a little extra. Imagine a temple administrator, perhaps looking a bit harried, as royal scribes or specialized temple auditors descend upon his storerooms and archives. They aren't there for a friendly chat. They are there to compare the physical inventory of barley and oil against the meticulously kept clay tablets. They are there to scrutinize loan agreements, cross-reference payments, and ensure that every shekel and every gur of grain is accounted for. It was a rigorous process designed to catch discrepancies, prevent embezzlement, and maintain trust in the system. These ancient audits weren't just about catching criminals, though that was certainly a part of it. They were also about ensuring efficiency and accuracy. Was the temple distributing its rations properly? Were all the taxes from a particular region being collected? Was a merchant accurately reporting his profits from a trade expedition? The auditors, often senior scribes themselves, would meticulously review tablets, sometimes comparing multiple copies of records, or even conducting on-site checks. Think of it as a very hands-on, dusty version of a modern forensic audit. One key aspect of these audits was the reconciliation of physical inventory with written records. It wasn't enough for a scribe to simply write down that 500 sheep were delivered to the temple. An auditor might physically count the sheep, or at least verify the records of their consumption or distribution. If the numbers didn't match, questions were asked and explanations demanded. This direct verification was crucial in a world where manipulation of records was always a possibility, even on clay. A quirky tidbit: sometimes seals on tablets were not just for witnessing, but also for authentication during an audit. An auditor might check that the correct seal of the granary master was present on a delivery receipt, verifying that the transaction was legitimate and not fabricated. It was an early form of chain of custody tracking. You wouldn't want a granary master with sticky fingers to use someone else's seal, now would you? The existence of such auditing practices tells us a great deal about the scale and complexity of the Babylonian economy. It demonstrates that the authorities understood the importance of financial oversight and accountability, not just for moral reasons, but for the practical stability of their vast institutions. Without regular checks, the system would inevitably collapse under the weight of inefficiency and corruption. These auditors were the unsung heroes of ancient financial integrity, ensuring that the wheels of commerce, though made of clay, turned smoothly. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these audits was the prevention of fraud and theft, or more broadly, the maintenance of central control over a vast and decentralized economic system. Were they mostly about catching individual cheats, or about ensuring the efficient operation of the entire state apparatus? Regardless, the meticulous nature of these ancient checks and balances highlights a profound understanding that trust in economic systems is built on verifiable records, and that even the most boring aspects of accounting are absolutely essential for a functioning society. After navigating the grand scale of temple accounts, state taxes, and ziggurat budgets, you now zoom in to a more intimate sphere of Babylonian life, the private accounts of ordinary households. While perhaps less glamorous than royal decrees or international trade, these humble records offer a remarkably human glimpse into the daily financial realities of ancient families. Imagine a modest Babylonian home, perhaps a small mud-brick dwelling in a crowded neighborhood. Even here, in the absence of grand estates, financial tracking was a necessity. While not every family had a dedicated scribe on retainer, many literate individuals, or those with access to a scribe, would keep records of their personal finances. These weren't elaborate balance sheets, but rather practical lists and notes designed to manage household income and expenditures. These private tablets reveal a fascinating array of daily transactions. You might find a farmer meticulously listing the barley harvested from his small plot, the number of sheep in his flock, or the quantities of dates collected from his trees. He would also record his expenses: how much grain was set aside for seed, how much was consumed by the family, what provisions were given to laborers, or what items were bartered for tools or clothing. It's the ancient equivalent of a family budget, scrawled on clay rather than a notepad. Think about a craftsman, perhaps a potter or a weaver. His private accounts would detail the raw materials purchased: so many lumps of clay, so many bundles of flax. Then he would list the items produced: X number of pots, Y lengths of linen. And crucially, he would record the sales: how many pots were sold for how much silver or barley and to whom. These were his profit and loss statements, providing a simple yet effective way to monitor his small business and ensure he was earning enough to support his family. One of the most poignant aspects of these private accounts is their often ephemeral nature. Unlike the Grand Temple archives, many household tablets were not intended for long-term preservation. They might be temporary records discarded once a transaction was complete or a season's accounts reconciled. This is why archaeologists find far fewer complete private archives compared to institutional ones. But the fragments we do find offer invaluable insights into the economic lives of common people, their struggles, their aspirations, and their daily routines. A quirky tidbit: some household tablets include simple personal notes or calculations that weren't strictly financial, but perhaps related to household management, like calculating how much beer to brew for a festival or figuring out the proper portions for a large family meal. It reminds you that these were not just dry financial documents, but reflections of lived experience. You can almost picture someone scratching out a quick sum to see if they could afford that new goat. These private accounts, though humble, are vital for historians because they offer a bottom-up perspective on the Babylonian economy. They complement the top-down view we get from royal and temple records, allowing us to understand how the grand economic systems impacted individuals and families. They show us the pervasive nature of accounting, reaching even into the most private corners of society, driven by the simple, enduring need to know, what do I have and what do I owe? Historians still argue whether the literacy rates among common Babylonians were high enough for widespread personal record-keeping, or if most private accounts were managed by professional scribes hired by families and small businesses. Was basic literacy more common than we assume, or did access to scribal services permeate deeper into society? Regardless, the simple act of a family tracking its income and expenses on clay highlights the fundamental human desire for financial order, a desire that stretches back millennia. From the intimate details of household budgets, you now broaden your view to encompass the sheer volume of recorded information in ancient Babylon. Where did all those millions of clay tablets, detailing everything from monumental ziggurat construction to a farmer's grain harvest, ultimately reside? The answer is in vast, meticulously organized spaces we can only describe as archives, the libraries of commerce. Imagine walking into a room not filled with scrolls on shelves, but with neatly stacked clay tablets, carefully arranged in rows, often on wooden or reed shelving that has long since disintegrated. These weren't just random piles. They were organized repositories, often within temple complexes, royal palaces, or the houses of prominent merchant families. These archives were the ancient world's data centers, preserving the economic memory of the state, the temple, and large businesses. The scale of these archives is truly astounding. Archaeologists have unearthed hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions of tablets from single sites. Each tablet is a record of a transaction, a legal agreement, a census, a tax receipt, or a list of goods. Think of the organizational challenge. Without a digital search function, or even indexed spines, how did they find the specific contract from 3 years ago detailing the sale of that particular field? The Babylonians developed ingenious, albeit low-tech methods for organizing these vast collections. Tablets were often grouped by subject matter, all the grain receipts in one section, all the loan agreements in another. Within these groups, they might be arranged chronologically or by the parties involved. They also used dockets, or tags, small clay labels attached to bundles of tablets indicating the contents of the bundle. Imagine a clay tag that says, "Loans from the year of King Zimri Lim's triumph over Mari," or "Barley deliveries from the southern district month of Ab's 17th year of Nabopolassar." It was an early form of metadata, allowing for retrieval in a system where browse wasn't really an option. One of the most famous examples is the archive of the Murashu family, a private banking and business firm from Nippur in the 5th century BCE. Their tablets reveal a staggering array of financial activities from tax farming to land leases and commercial loans. It's like finding the entire financial history of a major corporation all preserved on unassuming pieces of baked earth. A quirky tidbit, some archives even had catalogs, lists of tablet titles or summaries, allowing a scribe to quickly locate a specific record without having to dig through every single tablet. It was a table of contents for an entire room full of economic history. They were essentially creating a database without any actual data beyond the clay itself. These archives are the lifeblood of our understanding of ancient Babylonian society. They are not just dusty relics, they are living testaments to their economic sophistication. They allow historians to reconstruct family histories, trace trade networks, analyze inflation, understand taxation, and even map agricultural yields over centuries. Without these meticulous and carefully preserved records, much of what we know about this groundbreaking civilization would remain a mystery. Historians still argue whether the scale of these archives primarily reflects a bureaucratic obsession with control and documentation, or if it was a genuine practical necessity for managing complex economic activities in an environment without modern information technology. Was it driven by a love of paperwork or the cold, hard facts of necessity? Regardless, the commitment to creating and preserving these vast libraries of commerce highlights a profound belief in the power of the written record, a belief that underpins all modern financial systems. From the meticulous order of the archives, you now delve into one of the darker and most enduring consequences of ancient Babylonian economic life: debt slavery. While the accounting systems we've explored thus far speak of organization and progress, the harsh reality of unmanageable debt could strip individuals and families of their freedom, revealing the brutal underside of a highly structured economy. Imagine a scenario. A farmer, perhaps due to a series of poor harvests or a sudden illness in the family, takes out a loan from a wealthy merchant or temple. The interest rates, as we discussed, were substantial. If he couldn't repay the principal and interest by the agreed-upon time, the terms of the loan, meticulously recorded on a clay tablet, of course, could stipulate that he, or even members of his family, would have to work off the debt. This wasn't chattel slavery where people were bought and sold outright. It was a temporary, though often lengthy, loss of freedom due to financial obligation. Debt slavery was a pervasive feature of Babylonian society, a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of their economic system. Individuals, usually adult males, could sell themselves, or their family members' wives, children, into temporary servitude to settle debts. These contracts, like all others, were meticulously documented by scribes. They would specify the amount of the debt, the duration of the service, and the conditions under which the individual would be freed. Sometimes the debt could be inherited, meaning a child might enter servitude for a parent's unpaid obligations. It was a bleak cycle for many. The purpose of these records wasn't just to legitimize the arrangement. It was also to track the service rendered and ensure the debt was eventually extinguished. Imagine the grim ledger entries: X days of labor by son of Nabu, applied against 10 shekels debt. These records, though often heartbreaking in their implications, are crucial for understanding the social structure and legal mechanisms surrounding debt. They highlight the vulnerability of the common populace to economic hardship and the severe ramifications of being unable to meet financial obligations. A particularly grim, quirky tidbit: Hammurabi's code, while establishing debt slavery, also attempted to regulate it, stipulating that debt servitude for citizens should not last longer than 3 years. After 3 years, the person was supposed to be freed, regardless of whether the debt was fully repaid. This was an attempt to mitigate the harshest aspects, though whether it was always strictly enforced is another matter. It suggests a recognition that perpetual debt slavery could destabilize society. The existence of these debt records, often found alongside more mundane commercial transactions, reminds us that accounting wasn't just about prosperity. It was also about vulnerability and control. The very system designed to bring order and efficiency to trade and resource management also provided the mechanism for the most severe form of economic consequence for the poor and unfortunate. It speaks to a society that was both highly advanced in its administration and deeply stratified in its social realities. Historians still argue whether debt slavery was a necessary evil for economic stability, providing a form of social security for desperate individuals and ensuring the recovery of loans, or if it was primarily a mechanism for the powerful elite to exploit the labor of the lower classes. Was it a safety net, albeit a painful one, or a tool of oppression? Regardless, these meticulously kept records of human bondage driven by financial obligations offer a sobering counterpoint to the triumphs of Babylonian economic ingenuity. From the grim ledger entries of debt slavery, you now lift your gaze to a broader, more existential question about empires. How did all this meticulous accounting, all this intricate financial plumbing fare during the inevitable collapse of empires? Did the ability to track every shekel and every grain help to buttress a failing state, or did the very weight of bureaucracy become a hindrance? As external pressures mounted, imagine the grand city of Babylon, once the jewel of Mesopotamia, now besieged its walls, breached its power waning. Or picture the earlier Akkadian Empire, the first great multi-ethnic state, slowly fragmenting. Even as the political landscape shifted, the administrative machinery, including its vast accounting apparatus, would have continued to grind on, at least for a time. But how did it cope? In some ways, the very strength of Babylonian accounting might have prolonged the inevitable. A detailed understanding of resources, how much grain was in the granaries, how many soldiers could be provisioned, how much tribute was owed by rebellious provinces, could allow a struggling empire to make more informed decisions, to ration resources, and to direct its remaining strength more effectively. If you know exactly how much barley you have, you know how long your army can fight without starving. That's a powerful piece of information. However, the immense bureaucracy that enabled such detailed accounting could also become a vulnerability. Maintaining those vast archives, employing thousands of scribes, and enforcing complex tax systems required a stable, centralized authority. The central power weakened as provinces rebelled, or, as invaders swept through the sophisticated financial machinery, would inevitably break down. Records would cease to be collected, archives would be abandoned or destroyed, and the intricate web of economic control would unravel. It's hard to demand taxes from a region that no longer recognizes your authority, no matter how perfectly you've calculated their arrears. A quirky tidbit: some of the latest tablets found from periods just before an empire's final collapse show an increasing number of entries about unpaid debts, uncollected taxes, and complaints about broken agreements. It's like watching a financial system fray at the edges, slowly succumbing to chaos, all documented by the very scribes who were witnessing it. They were essentially recording the economic death spiral. Moreover, the very reliance on a highly centralized system meant that if the central authority itself was destroyed or overthrown, the entire accounting infrastructure could collapse with it. Unlike a decentralized market system that might adapt more easily, Babylon's economy, heavily reliant on temple and royal administration, was vulnerable to political instability at the top. The meticulousness that enabled its rise could also hasten its fall, as external shocks proved too much for the rigid structures to bear. These tablets, dating from periods of decline, offer a fascinating and often heartbreaking insight into the final days of an empire. They show us the signs of economic distress, the desperate attempts to maintain control, and ultimately the gradual cessation of detailed record-keeping as the administrative system gave way to chaos. They are the financial epitaphs of fallen powers. Historians still argue whether internal economic weaknesses, exacerbated by factors like overtaxation or debt, played a more significant role in the collapse of Babylonian empires than external military pressures. Did the accounting system, by revealing the true state of affairs, highlight insurmountable problems, or did it simply record a collapse driven by other factors? Regardless, the records tell a poignant story of how even the most sophisticated administrative systems can succumb to the forces of history, leaving behind only the ghost of their meticulous ledgers. Having witnessed the rise and fall of empires, you now consider the enduring impact of Babylonian accounting, a legacy that stretches far beyond the dusty ruins of Mesopotamia. Though their specific methods on clay tablets faded, their fundamental concepts and practices laid crucial groundwork for later, seemingly more advanced civilizations. This isn't just ancient history. It's the quiet, foundational hum beneath our modern world. Imagine yourself in the bustling marketplaces of ancient Greece or the sprawling administrative centers of imperial Rome, centuries after the last Babylonian scribe pressed his stylus into clay. You wouldn't find cuneiform tablets, but you would find merchants keeping ledgers, states, collecting taxes, and complex financial transactions taking place. And many of the underlying principles, though adapted and evolved, owe a silent debt to those Mesopotamian pioneers. Consider the very idea of standardized units of value and weight. The concept of the shekel as a unit of silver weight for valuing disparate goods was a crucial precursor to the development of coinage. While the Greeks and Lydians eventually invented true minted coins, the Babylonian understanding that money didn't have to be a physical object, but could be an abstract unit of account, was a profound intellectual leap. It paved the way for more sophisticated monetary systems. The meticulousness of Babylonian record-keeping also influenced later cultures. The Romans, famed for their administrative efficiency, certainly built upon earlier traditions of detailed census, records, tax rolls, and military logistics. While their methods used papyrus and wax tablets, the underlying drive for comprehensive documentation, for ensuring every asset and every debt was accounted for, echoed the diligent work of the Babylonian scribes. They taught the world that effective governance and commerce relied on visible, verifiable numbers. A quirky tidbit, the Babylonian sexagesimal base 60 number system, which they used for their calculations and accounting lives on, in surprising ways even today. Why do we have 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle? It's a direct inheritance from the mathematical and astronomical practices that were intricately linked to Babylonian accounting. So next time you check your watch or measure an angle, you're inadvertently giving a nod to an ancient Babylonian accountant. Furthermore, the legal framework for contracts, loans, and property rights, as codified in texts like Hammurabi's Code, provided a conceptual blueprint for subsequent legal systems. The idea that agreements should be written down, witnessed, and enforced, and that financial obligations carry legal weight, transcended the specific form of clay tablets. It was the blueprint for commercial law, establishing principles that would be reinterpreted and refined by the Greeks, then the Romans, and eventually become cornerstones of Western legal tradition. Historians still argue whether the direct transmission of Babylonian accounting knowledge was widespread, or if later, civilizations independently developed similar systems out of similar needs. Was it a conscious inheritance or a parallel evolution? Regardless, the undeniable fact is that the Babylonians were among the very first to grapple with the complexities of managing a large-scale economy through meticulous documentation, setting a precedent that would resonate across millennia. Their quiet, methodical dedication to balancing the books, even in an age of empires and gods, truly laid the invisible foundations for the financial world we inhabit today. And so, after millennia of meticulous scribing, from the first tentative wedges in wet clay to the vast archives of mighty empires, you arrive at the present moment, reflecting on how these seemingly arcane practices of ancient Babylon still subtly underpin our incredibly complex digital financial world. The journey from clay tablet to cloud computing might seem vast, but the fundamental principles remain remarkably similar. Imagine yourself scrolling through a digital spreadsheet filled with columns of numbers meticulously categorized and summed. Or perhaps you're checking your bank balance on your phone, seeing your debits and credits instantly updated. These modern tools, with their incredible speed and complexity, are direct descendants of those ancient Babylonian ledgers. The need to track income, expenditure, assets, and liabilities, it's the same core requirement that drove the earliest scribes. Consider the concept of a balance sheet. It's essentially an updated version of a temple inventory tablet, listing what's owned and what's owed. The idea of interest on a loan, while now calculated with algorithms rather than a reed stylus, is the direct intellectual heir of those Babylonian loan agreements. Property registries, company contracts, tax codes all echo the meticulously documented deeds, agreements, and royal levies that filled Babylonian archives. We still depend on the idea of a verifiable, immutable record of financial transactions. A quirky tidbit that brings it home: your bank account number and routing number are in essence highly sophisticated versions of the unique identifier that a Babylonian scribe might have assigned to a specific account tablet or the seal of a merchant. It's all about identifying who owes what to whom, and where those financial flows are supposed to go. Even the double-entry bookkeeping system that revolutionized Renaissance accounting has conceptual roots in the Babylonian practice of cross-referencing different types of accounts to ensure accuracy. The shift from physical clay to ephemeral digital data is monumental, of course. But the human desire for accountability, for clarity in transactions, for the prevention of fraud, and for the efficient management of resources, that hasn't changed. We've simply found faster, more automated ways to to do what those patient scribes did. By hand, one wedge mark at a time. Every time you receive a digital receipt or check your online bank statement, you're interacting with a system built on principles first solidified thousands of years ago in Mesopotamia. Historians still debate whether the human brain has an inherent predisposition for numerical order and financial tracking, leading to similar accounting systems emerging independently across different cultures, or if there's a more direct, albeit often invisible lineage of knowledge transmission. Was it universal human ingenuity, or a specific historical legacy? Regardless, the silent echoes of Babylonian accounting are undeniable, reverberating through our modern financial institutions, our legal frameworks, and even our daily routines. Now, as the long journey through ancient Babylonian accounting draws to a close, let the details of the past softly fade. The rustle of ancient reeds, the smell of damp clay, the faint whisper of numbers being tallied in a long-forgotten tongue. Let them all dissolve into the stillness of your quiet space. The meticulous efforts of those long-ago scribes, working by flickering lamplight, laid foundations that endure a testament to the quiet power of order and numbers. But for now their work is done. Allow your mind to gently release the intricacies of ancient ledgers of shekels and barley contracts and ziggurats. Let the weight of history settle not as a burden, but as a calming hum, a deep resonance of the past meeting the present. The figures, the sums, the careful calculations, they've served their purpose for tonight. Your own accounts can rest.